function or the chat, and we'll try to get you into the discussion as we hear from you later in the program. And I'd also like to note Elizabeth Tobia, who is my partner here in Michigan. I'm in Lansing, Michigan, actually in Liz's house. She's helping me with the technical support. So as I indicated, many in our countries are wringing our hands and living in fear of our democracies continuing to be undermined and pulled down by demagogues peddling resentment-driven politics that divide our countries and undermine our common purpose and identity. And then when in office, whack away at the pillars of democracy: free speech, free press, independent judiciary, tolerance, and respect for civil rights. But we should all take lessons in heart from the counterexamples, and that's what we're here to talk about today, where leaders who are interested and do inspire and rally the electorate to keep and rebuild democracy. Those instances in which leaders who do want to make a difference in people's lives and work to strengthen, not weaken democracy, do win over voters and win elections, even in the regions that more often are the font of support for the polarizing populist movements. And this is what we're here to talk about. Our jumping off point is Poland, where last fall's victory by Donald Tusk and his coalition turned out the right-wing populist Law and Justice Party, who were dismantling democratic institutions, and now they are working hard to rebuild democratic institutions and the practices that were purposely undermined by Law and Justice for years. And we also want to revisit the counter story offered from the UK and the United States, the examples of how leaders who do want to deliver meaningful policy solutions and make lives better for people, rebuild communities and support new good jobs and opportunity, as opposed to sow resentments and culture wars. Those leaders can and do succeed in getting elected and staying elected, again, even in regions that often are where polarizing populists and demagogues who feed them win elections. So to help us do that, we're joined by Camille Longu. He's a graduate student at Georgetown University here, though his family is from southeastern Poland, and he's tracked closely the Polish and lived the Polish experience and can provide some insight there. Lucas Cruiser, who's another student, graduate student at Georgetown University and a support and a research helper on this Transforming Industrial Heartlands initiative from Pennsylvania. He did the research and wrote the initial paper on what happened in the Polish election and what we can learn from it. I'm also joined by my partner, Andy Westwood, who's a professor of government practice at the University of Manchester in the UK and one of the ringleaders of our work across the Atlantic in accelerating economic change to the industrial regions of the UK and beyond. And it's right in the middle of all the policy moves that they're furiously making in the UK to try to level up the kind of shattered and declining northern communities that were actually where the Brexit vote emanated from. And he'll talk more about that. And finally, Robin Johnson, who I know well. He's a professor at Monmouth College in Illinois, teaches a class to his students about heartland politics and what we can do to bring opportunity. He also has been sort of the lead author and advisor to elected officials, congresspeople, on how to better connect, better understand, but also better communicate and deliver for heartland voters. And Robin's done some great work sort of understanding how we can, must engage with folks in the heartland. So first, I want to turn to Camille and the Polish perspective. Give us a feeling for the political dynamics in Poland over the past 10 years. Who, where, and why did the right-wing populists and Law and Justice come to power? And where was their support coming from?
Of course. Well, thank you, John, so much for having us. What comes with the Polish case for the past 10 years, sort of, we have to go in the context of, Poland in '89, had the roundtable talks, the transition to democracy from communism, and also the transition from a command economy to a capitalist one, and then also European integration. Those sort of complex sort of geopolitical and political economic changes really sort of shifted sort of Poland, sort of domestically, when you think about like the sort of the economic and social standings of people. And then, once again, if you look at the macro level, Poland was very much a success story. The growth grew sixfold in that 30 year period since the fall. But once again, this economic growth was quite unequal on the macro level. Yes, GDP was up. There was increased foreign direct investment, excuse me. But this really accentuated a lot of regional differences, a lot of class and sort of urban rural divides. Specifically during this post communist period, a lot of the growth has happened in the western parts of the country, where there has been immense sort of infrastructure coming from the fact that during the German imperial period, there was actually investment in those parts of Poland, and also sort of service-based economies in the big cities, leaving east and the south, either impoverished, or they have not won, you can say, during the transition. In addition, there's the cultural factor of a little more, slightly more socially liberal, a little more secular cities versus a deeply pious, deeply patriotic countryside and small towns. And with that, you can clearly see sort of law and justice, peace, the Polish acronym, sort of really taking into account both appealing to the South and East's both patriotic senses, with both the Kaczynski twins, being very strong characters during the Solidarity movement. I mean, Donald Tusk was themselves, and the thing is, a lot of Polish politics is very much descendant of factions from the Solidarity movement. But once again, going back to with peace, this party, a sort of a national conservative right-wing populist party that fuses both that traditional Catholic values with much more economic interventionism, some economic patriotism, a little isolation, and sort of finding the voice of people that they felt were sort of left behind during the transition to capitalism and integration. During the 07-08, between 2007 and 2015, when PO, Civic Platform, Donald Tusk's party, was in power, this is a center-left liberal party that very much ran Poland during those initial sort of transition to the European Union, saw immense macroeconomic growth. On the Polish side, they skirted the 08 recession, but at the same time, salaries were still low in many parts, regions of Poland. Polish people were, leaving abroad in order to make money and send remittances, and so there was some economic, dissatisfaction. There's also, that cultural divide between the urban and rural, with the urban elites being shown as these out-of-touch cosmopolitans. During that same period, PO, the Civic Platform, tended to have also this sort of aloof, out-of-touch sense. The president, Bronisław Komorowski from Civic Platform, was very gaff-ridden, very sort of out-of-touch, almost sort of not a popular character, and sort of mixing of those elements, the economic economic dissatisfaction and sort of this elite disdain for the elite, really pushed PiS to win the 2015 elections, both the presidency and the parliament, in order to sort of satisfy that. And then since that, this really created this this dynamic in Poland, which you had PiS, which had its strongholds in sort of the rural parts of Poland, small towns, sort of the east and the south. Meanwhile, a Civic Platform, the opposition, still reigned sort of a lot in the cities in the west, even though I would say still in the west, in the small towns, you did see some PiS leanings, mostly because of, either, it usually ranges from, as you can call, sort of either disdain or sort of fatigue from the ruling party. But once again, I think the biggest thing you can see with these current elections and the tide going back to the opposition was twofold. Firstly, sort of PiS and their inability to sort of handle the complexities of post-2020 crises and sort of not delivering sort of the economic satisfaction that people have, in addition to, once again, threats of democracy, threats to civil liberties, in addition to a number of scandals that really soured a lot of people's tastes and really mobilized the electorate to go against it.
I want to come back to what just happened in Poland. Obviously, that sort of context is all news to me and many of us, because we were so ignorant, and I'll speak for myself, not really tuned into the political dynamics in a place like Poland until all of a sudden it's really important that we do. And that's why we're here. But similarly, Rob, and I want to turn to the US now, because I do know that the whole world has been fascinated and mesmerized and frightened about what the heck is going on in the American Midwest. Where did Trump come from? So can you take us back to 2016? What was going on in the Midwest? Where were the Democrats? What was Trump selling that people were buying at that time that allowed him to take office?
Yeah, I remember that time very well, and I remember seeing subtle signs that Trump was gonna do well and surprise people. I took my students from Monmouth College to a rally Trump had in Burlington, Iowa, and there weren't many people in suits and ties there. It was a working class crowd, and they loved his message. He spoke plainly. He didn't speak in political protested language. Bernie Sanders did too. A lot of working class voters like both of them because they spoke directly and in language they could understand. I think economically, the decline of manufacturing really hurt a lot of people in many of the small factory type towns in the Midwest. Near where I live, a Maytag refrigerator plant shut down and moved to Mexico after the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, took place. We saw a hemorrhaging of jobs. And why is that more important in the Midwest? Because we were more dependent on manufacturing for our economic base. Globalization had some good impacts with agriculture, but with manufacturing, it really hurt our region. And at the time, of course, Hillary Clinton, the nominee for president in 2016, her husband Bill had passed NAFTA. At the time, President Obama was trying to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement as well. So in walks Donald Trump speaking, and I remember hearing him on satellite radio. And as somebody from a blue-collar family, from a union household, I remember his speech was really good. It was attractive. He talked about bringing manufacturing jobs back. He talked about building up infrastructure. And I found myself thinking, oh boy, this is going to appeal to people out here. And it did. It did well enough in many rural counties and the factory counties to be able to win three key states that were called the Blue Wall, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And that was enough to put him over the top. But as far as that time, that specific time, it was like a perfect storm with Trump's message, his plain style of speaking, a weak Democratic candidate, and especially in terms of the decline of manufacturing in the Midwest region is what all combined to produce that Trump victory. Even though, again, he lost the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College vote.
Thanks, Robin. I want to go to Andy Westwood. Help us understand the similar context in the UK. Before the Brexit vote, what were the voters in North and Eastern English, former mining, manufacturing, industrial regions thinking and feeling? And what I gather have been years of kind of London-centric politics and policy resulted in?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, it's great to be here. Great to be with everybody talking about these issues because they're so important. And I think, already just listening to what everyone said, we've been facing very similar sort of situations, very similar structural economic changes, largely in the UK. In those areas, we've come to know those areas as the red wall in the UK as opposed to the blue wall in the Midwest. Because, these were traditional Labour heartlands, manufacturing, strong kind of industrial base. These are the places where the kind of Labour Party began. And the decline in those industries really since the 1970s and 80s have been steady and profound. But in very recent or in more recent times, since the financial crisis, we've seen a kind of wave after wave of shocks. First of all, we saw austerity, where the kind of incoming Conservative government, quite a moderate Conservative government, implemented a big program of cuts to local services, to local infrastructure, all of which kind of hit the balance sheets then, but the services didn't really start deteriorating until later. Then we had obviously the Brexit vote in 2016, the same year that kind of Trump was elected in the US. And then obviously we had COVID. But since the financial crisis, we've seen just that sort of not just that steady deterioration of opportunities, of incomes, of living standards in those places. We've also seen the kind of growing inequality across regions. We're very kind of centrally dominated economically by London and the Southeast, and very centrally dominated in government terms by London and the Southeast. So again, like in the Midwest, it wasn't hard for some politicians to come in and whip up the anger that was already there. You know, people could see the deterioration in their own living standards, their own life chances, and the places around them. And so, you know, they wanted people to listen to that frustration and to that anger and to that kind of growing sense of disconnection from Westminster and Whitehall and the people that ran the government. But they also kind of wanted answers. You know, they wanted their places and their lives to be the same as everybody else's. And so when politicians kind of came to them and said, you know, not only here's a list of people you can blame, here are a list of things that we can do to bring, you know, to bring your place back. And they were similar. They were similar kind of promises that similar politicians have made across the world. Where we've got to now is a period where the Conservative Party and government has kind of lurched more and more to the right, more and more to that populist end. They've made more and more of those promises, and they haven't delivered them. And so the electoral kind of dial, if you like, is swinging back to Labour. But the same challenge essentially remains, which is what's your policy mix? What's your kind of political story that's going to persuade people that you can turn this stuff around? And this stuff, you know, just looking at that grand sweep of change since the 1980s and since the financial crisis, there is a lot to turn around, and it's going to take a long time. And you know, people need to be with you for that long haul. And the danger is that kind of politics and voting has become more volatile, less trusting. People are less likely to give you kind of support over the long term. And so, you know, the crux of it comes down to kind of what's the policy mix that works, that really kind of can take these formerly industrial places and kind of restore the sort of living standards, the job opportunities that you know that people want and that people deserve.
I'm going to turn in a minute to what happened in Poland to kind of turn the story around. But I just got a list of a lot of great people tuned in. I really appreciate all of you. I wanted to flag a few. Dirta Eisenhower from North Rhine-Westphalia. Her and her leadership in that region have been a prime partner in this work. But also my old friend Bill Donahue. Bill's retired in Buffalo, New York, his home. But when I showed up in Flint trying to be helpful 30 years ago in economic development, Bill was running the local economic development organization, the CEO Leadership Council, and we both tried. Obviously, weren't as successful as we like to try to help a community like that lost so many jobs. You know, anchor employer GM, 70,000 jobs gone. What does it do to recover and to find a future? And they're still working on it. And we still need to help. So Bill, great to hear you or see you or not see you. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. But those are the kinds of people who care about this work that are tuned in. So thank all of you. Lucas, take us back to Poland. And what happened that did allow Donald Tusk and his civic platform to reforge a winning coalition and an electoral victory? And Lucas, as I noted, did the paper that in much more detail, it's published by the Jefferson Education Society, kind of tells the story of the Polish election and lessons we can all learn from it when we're facing similar dynamics, as you just heard, from in the US and the UK and other countries. Lucas.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for having me and the other panelists here today for this important discussion. So I'm going to pick up where Kamil left off. So Law and Justice is kind of the far-right party in Poland and has been in power since 2015. And its coalition is mainly kind of more rural voters in small towns that tend to be more religious and often in the South and East Poland. And since Law and Justice began its rule, Poland has really had years of cultural wars and democratic backsliding. The party has really been effective in both capturing the country's courts and its media ecosystem. And so this has really kind of, made it hard for the opposition to organize in Poland, and has even now led in kind of recent years to the EU taking action. The EU started to invoke Article 7, which would have stripped Poland of some of its rights in the EU, and they withheld billions of dollars in structural and development funds. And so kind of these broader political changes have really started to make people sour on the ruling party. And then they've also, on top of them, there have been a number of recent challenges that have tarnished Law and Justice's image in recent years. There's been a couple high-profile corruption scandals. Inflation and the cost of living has skyrocketed in the country. And there's also been an influx of cheap grain from Ukraine that has angered a lot of farmers in rural areas. So as I said, voters have started to sour on the party after so many years of it being in rule. And so in the recent election this past fall, Tusk basically emerged as the main opposition candidate. And he's been around in Poland for decades. As Kamil mentioned, he was part of Poland's pro-democracy movement, beginning with the fall of communism. He was formerly a prime minister, and then later he was president of the European Council. And so he's very centrist, very pro-European. And in this recent election, he basically formed a coalition between his kind of large center party and two smaller parties called Civic Union. And their coalition was kind of more the cities, young voters, educated, and Western Poland. But they really they banded together and campaigned on defeating law and justice, even going so far as to pitch it as a battle between good and evil. And they really had a message kind of touting democracy and the rule of law, trying to draw a stark contrast with Law and Justice. They also spoke about returning to kind of a national dialogue with more cultural and political moderation. Law and Justice had really used the media environment to attack Tusk and certain ethnic and social minorities. And they also really promoted having a better relationship with the EU, such that things like the development funds might be returned to Poland, which would support a lot of areas. And then this coalition and Tusk also actively campaigned in small towns and rural areas to try to chip away at Law and Justice's key base of support. And this strategy was very effective. This big coalition between Tusk and the other small parties won 54% of the vote. Nevertheless, Law and Justice is still very popular. Poland has a multi-party system, and Law and Justice still won a plurality of the votes with about 31%. But by banding together with these other small parties, adopting kind of a centrist message that was very pro-European, pro-democracy, and touting moderation and the rule of law, they were able to come through in the end. And more broadly, this really just indicates that despite years of backsliding, Poles are still broadly committed to democracy, the rule of law, and the European project.
Great. Kamil, you're closer to a Polish perspective. Tell us more from your perspective of not just who the Kaczynski twins are, because all of this is news to us, but what do you think are the key takeaways in terms of how and why Tusk and that coalition were able to succeed, to win?
Well, thank you again for the question. And as my colleague Lucas pointed out, it's for this election, it was that mix of both dissatisfaction because of the scandals, the attacks on democracy, civil liberties, minorities, and whatnot, in addition to mishandling the economy. Because I think it's very important to note that a lot of the reasons why PiS came to power was because of economic dissatisfaction, even though, or the perception of the economic dissatisfaction in these regions. And I do feel that part of sort of Tusk's campaign and sort of the position of the civic platform was to sort of accept and not question a lot of the social spending. So one of the key social programs that Peace put on is the 500+ program, which was a child allowance introduced to sort of help aid families, which was very popular in Poland. And that's something that was accepted and sort of put into the platform of civic platform in many of these centrist parties in Poland. And so, yeah, so I feel that in this specific, reign, a campaign, comparing it to the 2020 presidential campaign of the opposition candidate Rafał Trzaskowski from Warsaw, who had a wonderful campaign, also had this centrist, pro-European, pro-democracy voice, but still did not really reach both that small town demographic in addition to really addressing those economic issues, which Tusk was really successful in accepting a lot of the sort of good policy you can, despite pieces, questionable other actions when it comes with democracy and whatnot. But when it comes with economic management, sort of knowing that in previous sort of liberal governments has led to the dissatisfaction, that's something that was recognized, in addition to sort of reaching out to those small and mid-sized towns was really big in sort of the Tusk strategy. Once again, if you look at this election, this was a record election with record voter turnout, 74%, which is insane for Polish standards, the highest record that ever come out since the post-89 period. And then not only that, but if you look at specific sort of demographics that's flipped to voting for Tusk, this included medium-sized towns and also middle-aged voters between 40 and 50. This, voting bloc tends to be a little swing. They tend to, of course, vote for their self-interest. And we see them in that demographic really accepting the Tusk message. In addition, also we need to remember that it is a coalition, and that also Trzecia Droga, Third Way, which is another party, which is a mix, a partnership of the agrarian, sort of a center-right agrarian Polish People's Party, and also Poland 2050, which is a moderate Christian democratic movement by a TV presenter known as Szymon Hołownia, who has now become sort of the speaker of the lower house in Poland. They also presented a very attractive message and also as an alternative to Tusk and Peace as this duopoly. But once again, there was a very interesting campaign between the two parties in which they both campaigned for their parties separately, but also also present a message of, hey, of focusing more of their anger towards peace versus sort of internal fighting as well. And so you can clearly see that this unity was also a wonderful message that this current campaign implemented for them to lead for the opposition to collect 54% of the vote.
Great. Let's go back to the U.S. and our heartland with Robin. Can you talk a bit more about the political, economic dynamics? Why are Democrats toxic today in places that are struggling, or rural areas, or where they've lost lots of manufacturing jobs? And then flip it around on me. How and why do some Democrats still win in Trump country? What are they doing?
The dynamics right now are such that you've got this enormous urban-rural divide. Big cities, counties with big cities vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Rural areas vote overwhelmingly Republican. And the suburbs are the main battleground. Places where large universities exist, and my class just did some research on this, where large numbers of people with college degrees vote overwhelmingly Democratic, and counties adjacent with fewer college graduates vote the exact opposite. We call it the diploma divide here, and it's the biggest differentiator now. The problem is there are quite a few more people in the United States without college degrees than with. And the Democrats have been a little slow to react to that, I would say, and it's hurting them, especially here in the Midwest region, which is the Heartlands, I think, are still going to decide. They decided the election in 2016. The three blue wall states turned back to Biden in 2020. And I think the way it's shaping up, they're going to determine the 2024 race as well. So we've got this interesting phenomenon of Obama-Trump counties that actually voted for Obama twice and then Trump. And I live in one, and most of these counties are in the Heartland region. And John and I did some research with one of my classes that showed most of them stayed with Trump in the 2020 race. So the margin of error for Democrats is really slight, and that's why it's critical for the Democrats to make inroads in rural areas and in these factory towns, which they're losing. And we've seen evidence of people being able to do that and overcome the brand. Former Congresswoman Sherry Bustos, who represents this area, which went for Trump, we collaborated on some research where we talked to over 100 state legislators who won in rural and working class districts. And what they were saying basically was there is a path to win, but the Democratic brand makes it hard. I'd say, in short, the Democrats are seen increasingly as elitist, condescending out in these rural areas, and that they don't care. We had people knocking doors. Democrats reported to me that they would knock doors, and the party in 2016 was more focused on bathroom issues than they were jobs. And that was the overall narrative that was sent out to people, and I think that's part of why the Democrats struggle. But we, in talking to, like I say, over 100 people, it's simple, and I think this is what's promising as far as a return to democracy, in that they focus on grassroots campaigning, door knocking. Elections in the United States and elsewhere have become heavily focused on raising lots of money and going on TV, or putting pithy comments on social media. And they've gotten away from the basics of it, and that is knocking doors. As political scientists and as somebody who works campaigns, that's the single most effective way of reaching voters. And even these bigger campaigns have got to focus on that. And here's the second thing: they've got to do it year round. They can't just, when the election's over, turn the lights off and shut the door. The conservative organizations like the Koch brothers and all are doing this 365 days a year. And the Democrats have got to catch up, but they can do it. Get volunteers out in these rural areas, these factory towns, go door to door, make neighbors the face of the Democratic Party instead of people in Washington. We talked to several people, including a new state senator from up in Michigan, Darren Camilleri, who talked about how going door to door gives you protection against negative attacks on TV ads, because they met you and they've seen you at the door, and it's like, well, he's not possible to do, he's not capable of doing this type of thing. So it takes democracy back to the grassroots level. It's cheap. It's just a good pair of tennis shoes, knock doors, meet people. It provides some inoculation. This to me is the most refreshing thing. We've got a campaign. Democrats need to campaign like it's 1924 instead of 2024. Go back to the grassroots. Along with that, radio in rural areas. The loss of community newspapers in our country has really hurt locally, and that's an entirely different topic. But it's almost like the party has got to assume that role right now on rural radio stations. It's one-sided. There's the Republicans have a monopoly, and the Democrats haven't competed there. Small town newspapers, just getting the word out locally about what the party's about, and again, branding it as the party of your neighbors. The other thing I would say is yard signs, and this was a very interesting thing we picked up in rural areas. I know the consultants were taught for many years to yard signs don't vote, but in rural areas, when you're struggling, a yard sign is a sign of ownership, and people see that and think, well, it's okay for this person to be for a Democratic Party candidate. Maybe it would be okay for us to do that as well. It was very simple, but that's the beauty in it, and that it goes back to the grassroots. And I think this is going to be critical if the Democrats adopt it, of returning to democracy. One last point: there was a state senator in Wisconsin who had an old red truck, and he would park it by the side of the road and put a handmade sign up that said "Stop and visit with Senator Jeff Smith." And he won. And this is a very rural area, but returning to the grassroots and listening, and not only listening to what people say, but how they say it and speak in their language. I think those are, sorry for going on so long, but these are critical ideas we found from people that actually won. It's not me, It's not a test or academic research. It's absolutely listening to people that won and trying to spread that word.
We definitely need some antidotes to all these people that have painted their barns with Trump MAGA 2024 that you see driving around rural America. It's very disturbing. But Andy, you're from a similar place. I mean, you're from like the heart of England, Wolverhampton, and you're in the center. Wes Robin's in the center of our country, and I know you've worked with a lot of elected officials in your region who are really trying to make a difference and who have been successful as constructive change makers. What's their secret?
Well, there are multiple things, and I think it speaks a lot to kind of what Robin's just said, and obviously again the parallels are clear. The same, very much that same education split. You've got kind of politics kind of breaking across education level. People with higher education are more likely to be more mobile, as well as more likely to do well economically. People with kind of lower levels of education are more likely to be stuck in the kind of heartland places, and kind of and they have no choice but to improve the kind of place that they're in. And showing up to those places and being in those places and being of those places is what matters, because people can tell if you've just come from out of town just for a campaign. And that is a real kind of problem for all political parties to overcome. What we've seen, I think, in recent elections is this development. Even clearly the same two big parties plus one or two others are sort of slugging it out, whether it's for local elections, mayoral elections, which is kind of the new innovation, if you like, in our democracy. So the big city regions have now all got mayors and kind of city region agencies, and obviously that's the same kind of issue nationally. But at that mayoral level and at the local level, we've seen the kind of most successful candidates really promote the kind of place first rather than political party first story. So in other words, I'm from here. I understand what this place needs. I will work for this place. I'll represent this place before I take orders from whoever's running whichever political party I theoretically kind of belong to. And we've seen that on right and left, actually. So we see that from Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester. We've seen that from kind of the former Conservative mayor in the West Midlands, a guy called Andy Street, who's just lost his mayoralty to the Labour candidate. And we see it from a guy in Teesside up in the northeast of England, a guy called Ben Houchen, who is now the only Conservative mayor in England. But he like kind of Andy Burnham basically will say it's place that matters most. And infamously, he was the only candidate who turned up to the vote without a party rosette on. Now, read into that what you will. But what you also see is not just that kind of that style of campaigning, that narrative, that storytelling. You also see emerging in these places real kind of concentration on the things that will potentially turn a place round. So, where we've got that education divide, all those mayors and the ones that are kind of being most successful are placing more emphasis on technical education, on community colleges or further education colleges, as we call them here in England. So trying to really build up the resource, kind of how responsive those places can be to local needs. All those politicians are spending a lot of time thinking about local services. So Andy Burnham, one of his biggest accomplishments is getting the buses working. Now that might not seem very much, but kind of, if you're working in Manchester and you need to get to a job, you need public transport to work, and you need it to be affordable, and you need to be able to rely on it. And, so things like buses, technical education, local services are not just the things that kind of make a place tick and make people's lives a bit easier. They're also sort of tangible evidence of kind of progress towards longer term things. So at the same time, you'll get kind of you'll get all of those politicians in all of those places talking about longer term investment, talking about green jobs, talking about new industries, talking about kind of new technologies, and really sort of, powering new industrial revolutions, if you like, that are going to make those places, to coin a phrase, great again. But to get there, to earn the trust of people to get there, you've got to also not just sweat the small stuff, but you've got to kind of, come across authentically as someone of that place that understands that place and cares about kind of the day-to-day lives of people in that place. And that's why you get some of those smaller things that seem like they're smaller, but whether the bus is on time, whether you can get kind of a course to train for a particular industry at the college down the road. And it's that combination of kind of big picture. This is why the future is going to look better, but also those kind of very local steps to kind of getting to that place that I think is the sort of hallmark of those politicians that are having most success. Certainly at the ballot box, only time's going to tell whether they have that success actually rebuilding the economies and life chances of places and the kind of people that live in them.
I want in a second to get Lucas and Camille talking about, we've got all these elections across Europe and elsewhere. What are strategies that worked in Poland that might be similarly effective elsewhere? But first, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I invite others to throw them in. And there's a couple, Erica and Veronica had one real quick for you, Robin. What does year-round campaigning look like when the election's over, is one. And then Veronica Adams was saying, have you heard about dirt roads organizing? I gather at work in Maine, trying to emulate what you were just talking about. So what does year-round campaigning look like?
Year-round campaigning, I think one of the I would say, again, keeping in touch with voters. There's a kind of a new trend that was started in California, used in referenda. It's called deep canvassing, where you're not just going to the door for a quick conversation. You're asking voters, talk more about in terms of values, how voters talk about issues, how they sense issues, and you're listening more. And these conversations can take 10 or 15 minutes. I think it would be great to get out again and listen to voters year round, even in off years. And that's a great way of doing it, to understand the dynamics between how people feel about things. And I think you'll see that a lot of people, regardless of party, look at issues the same way. The differences aren't that stark for most who are in the middle. That's one idea. I think having the funds to get on the radio. There's a local union in Southwest Pennsylvania funds a weekly radio show that would just to get on an alternate viewpoint, the Democratic viewpoint. That's another idea. And again, the consultants will tell you, don't mess around with these small town community newspapers that come out once a week. Those are like the journal of the community. You got to be visible in those. You've got to be talking to people in those. And I would say, whether it's regular articles or ads, those are three ways, I think, of trying to stay visible in the off years. I have heard that group. I know that Senate district is heavy with college graduates, so it's not your typical rural district up in Maine. But I have heard of that group, and anything that people can do to get the idea out, the message out. Again, that rural areas shouldn't be written off. And just gaining, the idea isn't necessarily to win them, but to gain 2 or 3 points. If you look at what happened to Clinton in 2016 in Pennsylvania, for example, she won the big cities overwhelmingly, but all those little counties, small counties, ran up huge margins for Trump, and it's what ultimately cost her. So it's an idea to try to make a difference at the margins. And I'm convinced, based on my discussions, that there are the people out there, the votes out there, to make that difference and edge up the Democratic vote some in these rural places.
You just reminded me, we had a similar discussion, which Jamie Driscoll, the former mayor of Tyne on Newcastle, was relating as he was talking to his constituents before Brexit. They weren't talking about the European Union and being done to. They were talking about no one sees us, no one listens to us. So listening and showing up appear to be common strategies. What else, Lucas and Camille? What did happen? What did the Polish winning coalition do in terms of strategies or tactics that might be also lessons that could be applied elsewhere?
I can start. I would say two main things would be taking advantage of the weaknesses of incompetency. I would say the biggest thing we've definitely noticed is that right-wing populists tend not to govern as well as it is expected. And I think we can clearly see this in the UK example after, what, 12 years of sort of Tory rule. They have not delivered as much as the electorate expected. And I feel that for the opposition or for pro-democracy voices, a focus on competency and sort of focusing on the policy shortcomings of the anti-democratic or populist bent. In addition, one thing we also need to understand is that, and this could be a slippery slope, and I do understand, I like to, of course, preface this and put an asterisk, but at a certain point, when it comes with this listening, there will be chances in which the pro-democracy parties will need to either succumb or take in some of the policy positions of the right wing, of these not saying when it comes with, destroying, institutions, but at least some of the issues in which they've proposed, which have been popular. For example, in the Polish case, social programs, social spending, in order, civic platform finally came around to actually accepting the reality that social spending was good, which was something that before peace, in their previous tenure in the 2000s, early 2010s, that was a shortcoming of theirs. And so these two things is focusing on the incompetence and the policy shortcomings of sort of anti-democratic forces, in addition to recognizing what is the good policy or what the people are asking for, and trying to focus on developing effective policies around those issues.
Lucas, what are some other insights from Poland?
Yeah, great. Well, I think Kamil, really got at it. I think it's important to recognize that Tusk and his civic platform did, they had outreach to rural voters and small towns, and eventually did take up some of the policies of the far right Law and Justice. So this clearly indicated to some of these more rural small town voters that they would be represented by this other party. And I think we could see parallels to the US. I think there are, again, focusing on economic issues. There are many areas that could cut across urban and rural divides, such as, the cost of healthcare in this country, childcare, and returning to Andy in the UK, pathways to the middle class through education. It doesn't necessarily need to be a 4-year degree, but we could see, much more investment in vocational training and apprenticeships. And then finally, kind of returning to Poland, so we have kind of the economic issues that would reach out across geographies. I would also kind of highlight centrist candidates. I mean, Tusk is a centrist. His platform is very centrist, and that allowed him to both kind of straddle a largely kind of urban young coalition, but also make major inroads in the more rural areas of the country. And I think, fielding more moderate candidates with platforms that address kind of the economic realities and insecurities of people in sort of these more rural places will help kind of pro-democratic parties across the Transatlantic win in upcoming elections.
And we have a Congresswoman, Alyssa Slotkin, here in Michigan, who's a centrist Democrat who has won in what otherwise is a Trump region. She talks about, and she's now running for U.S. Senate and could win here in Michigan this year. She talks about just showing up and losing less badly in rural areas. And it seems like that's a common strategy and approach. Andy and Robin, similarly, what where are the political dynamics in our countries just unique to our countries, but what are strategies and tactics that you see uh, for leaders who do want to deliver policy solutions and better lives and preserve democracy? What's transportable and cuts across countries in your view? Andy?
Well, I think what we've already heard, and I'd kind of add my voice to things that both Robin and Camille and Lucas have just said. I think kind of competence, doing what you promise and doing it well, so that people can rely on it. That matters. I think, as Robin says, you got to show up. You got to be there. You got to. People have got to believe you when you're fighting for the place, and the only way they're going to believe you is if they see you there. So that matters. I really want to kind of also pick up on the kind of being there in the way local institutions function. So and I would include local media, local newspapers, local radio, incredibly important. Obviously in steep decline, so that's something that kind of the local state may wish to kind of find ways to support in new ways. But I think Camille's point about sometimes needing to, as a result of that, needing to kind of not just identify some of the kind of grievances or things that are popular, but actually kind of being happy enough to accept some of those things and incorporate them in kind of your own plans for places. A lot of that comes down to sort of civic pride, the standard of services, iconic local facilities, buildings, places, sports clubs, town centres, really kind of taking on board how serious those sort of institutions and facilities and parts of places are, to the way that people feel about their own well-being and the well-being of those particular areas. So you don't need to just be in a place. You need to understand what makes a place tick, and you need to kind of put your full weight behind kind of not just maintaining those sorts of institutions and those things, but finding ways to invest in them so that they can thrive. Whether it's a local theatre, a local football club in my case, a local pub, a local high street, a local newspaper. These are the sort of day-to-day indicators that people have and that attach people to their places. So it's as much about those issues as it is about the kind of grand investment plan for green jobs or a new manufacturing plant that's gonna come along, and you need it to come along in kind of 5 to 10 years time. But you've got to do that kind of smaller everyday stuff as you go. Otherwise, people aren't going to wait around and support you to deliver that kind of long-term change that they need to.
Robin, any additional thoughts on things we all can focus on if we want to try to have the folks who want to deliver something constructive win elections?
Here's a radical idea. Go ask people who win what they do. What's very frustrating to me is the Democratic Party seems to keep trotting out people who lost to speak on behalf of rural. It's like going to the last place team in the hockey standings and say, how do we get better? Instead of going to the top. And Andy Beshear is the governor of the state of Kentucky, a southern state here in the United States. He just won an off-year election in a state that went for Donald Trump. I can't remember, close to 70%. He did better everywhere, but especially in the rural and working class areas. Here's what everybody should be doing is asking Andy Beshear what his strategy was, what his formula was. But yet we keep trotting out people who lose. That's a very simple idea that I think people should be more aware of. John Fetterman, the U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, improved performance in rural areas. He's a small town mayor. What did he do? Roy Cooper is the governor of North Carolina, a swing state. What did he do to win? But you don't hear those names a lot because we keep, again, trotting out people who lost. It's very frustrating. So I will say that on top of everything else I said previously, what transforms other countries? Go to the grassroots, listen, year round, don't turn the lights off and shut the door in off years, and invest a little bit. It doesn't take as much. We're not talking TV or expensive consultants. We're talking grassroots, not door knocking, some radio, some newspaper, some outreach. Again, listen to people, what they say, and just as important, how they say it.
We've only got a couple minutes, but we do have another question from Jessica. Is there a gender gap in rural areas in US, UK, Poland? And if so, what, if anybody know, has been constructive in dealing with the gender gap? Anybody see that?
I think there is. I think there's a gender gap. Men are more likely to be Republican than women. That carries in rural areas too, to a degree, but it's not as much. I've seen evidence that rural working class women are just as pro-Republican or pro-Trump. But the biggest divide is definitely college attainment, education. That's the biggest one right now.
Andy, did you have any insight into that question?
Well, similar, very similar. It's more it breaks more on education level than on gender. That's not to say that gender isn't important, and that, you know, in that kind of everyday understanding of a place and the services and kind of assets of a place that matter, you know, a lot of those are kind of identified in different ways by men and women, and you know, and that, if you like, is an argument for kind of being in those places and talking to those people again. Yeah, as Robin says, actually the big divides are across both genders, but by education achievement.
Camille, did you have
talking about?
I would
Camille,
say, yeah, I would say in the Polish case, when it comes to it's age and gender. I would say for younger people under 30, there is a gender gap or a gender reconfiguration. But the thing is, it's not with the mainstream parties. A lot of young people in Poland tend to vote for either the left-wing Lewica or the farther right-wing Confederation. And you can clearly see that young men tend to vote for a Confederation, and then young women tend to vote for the left party, the Lewica. Once again, you don't really see this divide when it comes with older polls or when it comes to any education. It's very much a below 30 phenomenon, which is very similar to divides in South Korea, for example. And once again, this is a very much a sort of a culture war situation as well, which I feel could be a conversation for a different panel.
Well, we're going to continue to have these important conversations. I really want to thank all of you who tuned in, and I want to thank Jefferson Education Society for facilitating this one, and obviously thank Andy, Lucas, Robin, Camille, Liz for keeping us on track, Raven for turning the knobs and getting us here. It is, I mean, we wanted to talk about, with all these elections this year, what now are practical things that we can learn from each other about how those who do want to defend democracy and those who do want to create new economic opportunity and rebuild communities, how they can win elections versus those who want to blow up the system or blame somebody else or promise to bring back the past, which, as you know, is not the recipe. And that's because in the short term, we got to have more people, as Robin said, win elections who want to do some good versus some damage. In the long term, and our transforming industrial heartlands and rural areas, work is to learn to help each other bring new economic opportunity to people and places that aren't feeling it. Because we know in the long term, if folks are feeling good about their own futures, good about their community, they're optimistic and they're forward looking, and they don't respond to the resentment and the nostalgia or the incitement to burn down the house. So that's our goal in these discussions. We're having another one. We're having a series of study tours and visitations, but we're also going to continue these types of international discussions on key topics. I think the next one is going to be in a month or two with leaders from similar confections of countries around how you can overcome the green lash, meaning have rural and smaller town and industrial region leaders show the way that they can lead the great green transformation and win jobs and a better economy because of it, versus be fed the line that they need to fight the green transformation that's a bunch of elites in London or Berlin or US who are trying to foist climate change policies and practices on them. So these are things we're all facing. We're going to continue to have discussions about how we can collectively learn from each other and help each other in the fundamental work of accelerating economic change and opportunity and strengthening our democracies in the process. So I want to thank all of you for tuned in and thank my friends on the panel. And we'll no doubt have a better gender balance next time. And that's on me. So, but looking forward to it. I appreciate everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, John, for moderating this important discussion about preserving democracy. And thank you to our speakers, Lucas, Camille, Andy, Robin. Thank you for your insights on preserving democracy and all the work that you do. And also thank you to our viewers who tuned in for this discussion and were part of this discussion. So this is Raven Clark for the Jefferson Society, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.